Hi, I'm John Howard, and I'm going to be reading you a story from my grandfather, Jack Howard. The story's called The Year We Had Two Thanksgiving Days. Before telling the story, though, I'm going to give you a little background about Jack Howard and about what the story is about. Jack was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1875, and he lived a long life, passing away in 1971. He was a family man, a businessman, and a tireless sportsman who made countless trips into the woods of northern Maine and New Brunswick between 1900 and 1950 to hunt and fish. He found, however, that for him there was more sport in hunting with a camera than with a rifle, and he recorded his adventures in the big woods, as he called it, in hundreds of photographs which have come down to me. From 1915 onward, he spoke publicly about his experiences in a talk entitled The Call of Outdoors, and he was noted as a gifted storyteller. This story is, however, the only one that he ever wrote down. The story is about the year 1939. Jack Howard was 64 years old at the time, and he and a friend made a brief trip to Grand Lake Stream in Washington County, Maine. They met up with the noted guide, singer, and storyteller George William MacArthur and his family at their winter lodge and shared Thanksgiving dinner with them. And that's what the story is about. Here's the story. Do you remember the year when we had two Thanksgiving days? One was on the regular last Thursday of November, and the other was a special one worked up by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the sake of the merchants who thought the 29th of November was too close to Christmas. That year, I had a complimentary hunting and fishing license given to me by Mr. George Stobie, who was the Fish and Game Commissioner for the state of Maine. I warranted this honor on account of the fact that I give illustrated talks on hunting and fishing in Maine and Canada, in a way advertising the wonderful vacations in the big woods. And by the way, these talks are illustrated by the old glass lantern slides, colored by hand and made from glass 5 by 7 inch plates. Anyway, I had already had my hunting trip in Maine when a friend of mine put a proposition to me. He had a license but no deer. He had sold a .35 automatic rifle to a friend of his in Grand Lake Stream, and he thought that should pay for at least half of a little guiding and help him put his tag on a deer. The idea sounded good to me, so on the 28th of November, the day before the actual and legitimate Thanksgiving, we started by car, making Dennisville, Maine by that night. It was a little late for life in a country motel, but we put up in one that night. It was fairly cold, and we discovered too late to make a change that the toilet was frozen solid and cracked with ice. The next morning, we started out and made for Grand Lake Stream further up. When we got there, we found to our dismay the whole MacArthur family had moved up the lake to their fishing camps. However, we found one of the MacArthur boys was in town, and on talking with him, we learned that he was going up to their camp and would show us the way. There were about 5 or 6 inches of snow at the time, and walking was pretty tough. While I had my free license, my friend had his, and we had a good guide, we only had the last part of a pint, which among 3 cold men didn't go very far. On arriving at the camps, we learned there were 11 in the family, including a new bride and groom, a cow, some deer, and a very big black bear hanging from the porch roof. He was hung up by the neck, and his rear end was sitting on the ground. MacArthur said he would weigh over 500 pounds, and I guess he would. They offered to give the bear skin to me, but I figured it would be too heavy to lug out. I never saw a bigger bear, dead or alive. They had a cold cellar with all kinds of vegetables, and we had one of the very best Thanksgiving dinners I ever had. Everything from soup to mince pie made with venison mincemeat. Mrs. MacArthur and a couple of female relatives certainly put on a very swell feed way up in the big woods. The elder MacArthur was a fine specimen of a guide and a woodsman, well-informed naturalist, and a most interesting man to be with in the woods. The family was to stay in that camp all winter, and I certainly would have liked to have stayed there with them. They had plenty of food, with the deer frozen solid, and plenty of good fish from the chopping hole in the ice in front of the cabin. What more could you want? Plenty of good hardwood for cooking and keeping warm. Next day we packed a lunch with a pail and a handful of tea and started across the lake to a long point of land. It did not take us long to pick up a couple of deer and sit down and boil the tea. We had sandwiches made of slices of homemade bread, and I didn't know what was between the slices of bread. What do you suppose it was? Homemade mincemeat made of deer meat. I never ate anything that tasted so good or stayed with you as long as that combination. Homemade bread and venison mincemeat sandwiches. The next day we had to leave this fine setup, as we each had a deer to get out of the woods and back to Grand Lake Stream where the car was. They suggested that we cut small birch trees and tie the deer onto them and drag them down the lake on the ice. This worked out fine at first, but the deer kept falling off the branches onto the ice. It was hot work carrying the rifle, pulling the heavy load on a tree, and after a while we took off our coats and laid them on top of the deer, only to find that several times they fell off. We had to go back and pick them up. I had a special 30-30 lightweight rifle that I thought a lot of, but I would have given it away at that time had anyone come along. To make things more difficult, the ice was glass smooth, and I had on old leather-top rubbers with smooth soles that did not help the traction on the slippery ice. We got to the place where we could declare our deer and load them on the car and start for home. On the way, in the middle of the night, not near any town or gas station, we had a flat tire just to make the trip complete. Many years later, I had written the MacArthur family and thanked them for their kindness. I never heard of them again until last winter when the phone rang. My wife answered and said, "It's for you." And to my great surprise, it was my dear friend Mr. MacArthur calling from his daughter in Waterville. He had my letter with him, and he was delighted to know that he was talking to the man who had spent that long-remembered Thanksgiving Day with them up at the lake. He invited me and my wife to visit him that summer, saying he would guarantee me the best bass and trout fishing ever. I don't doubt that he could and would, but it does not look like we're going to make it. Now, a second story was appended to this one. It's very brief, and I'm going to read that to you as well. Among my many trips in the big woods, here is one worth remembering. The rifle was one of 3 made by the old Winchester Company. They were extra light, in fact, too light, and no more were ever made. I got it from that great old gunsmith Kirkwood on Elm Street in Boston, in trade for an old 30-20 that I didn't think was big enough for deer and moose. To make the rifle of interest to me, I had to recover it from the west branch of the Penobscot at Abbott Falls. One morning early, I took the old 18½ White Guide model canoe, empty, and placing this rifle on the gunwales of the canoe, I started to paddle in the quick water of the falls. I made a quick move to avoid a rock when the rifle slipped overboard. Marking the spot, I put the canoe on the shore and swam out to the spot where the rifle slipped overboard. I dove at least 5 or 6 times before I got my hands on the rifle, as the swift current would take me downstream from the right spot. Finally, I got it, and I started for shore. Now, if you think this is an easy job to swim with all your heavy winter clothes, mackinaw, woolen shirt and underwear, heavy pants, leather-top rubbers, and heavy wool stocking, mittens, etc., you just try it someday. If you enjoyed the story and you'd like to hear more about Jack Howard and see some of his pictures, please subscribe, and thanks for watching.